symptoms of overpopulation for you to deal with. We're not cannon fodder for your wars. We will fight for our freedom because we know what freedom feels like. And this is not it! This is not it!
People think they're free, but they're not. We've been given the illusion of freedom, the illusion of choice. That's the genius of these rulers, that they've created this society that's conditioned to deny what's right in front of its eyes.
Which is what?
That we're slaves.
Happy heresies, and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome with kindness and love to essential ingredients of Gnosis, Jesus declares in the Nag Hammadi Library. Welcome to Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. Always broadcast at the virtual Alexandria and always through the God above God, Dad Kim. We shy away from scholarly pontification and definitely shy away from New Age doublespeak. Divided we stand, together we rise, and our valid laser paint beam search for the central ethos of Gnostics throughout history. Ultimate liberation from all the constraints of this cosmos of boundaries, conformities, and just stupid-ass laws.
God has set before you this day his laws of life and good and death and evil. Those who will not live by the law shall die by the law.
Like my friend Jim West says, the Gnostics were the ultimate astral activists, attempting to save the most endangered species in this universe of Jehovah and his angelic mafia. The individual.
I am not a number. I am a free man.
We're deep in the rectum of the season of caustic American politics, where so many still fall under the illusion of the sham duopoly, or Zoroastrian duality of a two-party paradigm. I contend anarchism is the ultimate conclusion of the Gnostic-minded. The liberated individual, so endangered, finds the truth and understands he or she is disenfranchised, alienated, and cast down with the God in the gutter of Philip K. Dick. Same as some heretics felt 2,000 years ago.
And they haven't given us any other options outside the occasional purely symbolic participatory act of voting. You want the puppet on the right or the puppet on the left?
Not an easy red pill to swallow. I mean, the state, the ultimate manifestation of the archons in the material world, has persecuted the Gnostic-minded for centuries. So that's a slam-dunk argument for how to approach the government. Furthermore, humans are fallen monkeys, but do house the divine spark, making them higher than the gods, as the apocalypse of Adam states. And thus we must trust in the Promethean and Christ-like kindness and inventiveness of people. These two evidences, therefore, forge an attitude not found in the left or right, and bring us to a form of humanistic anarchism. I do like what Gordon White said, quote, "The only cure for tyranny is decentralization." Tyranny hates decentralization because it reduces predictability. I also like what writer Phil Rockstro said, "Vote for nobody, because nobody cares for the powerless in this country." We are all nobody in the eyes of the elite anyway.
If more of our so-called leaders would walk the same streets as the people who voted them in, live in the same buildings, eat the same food instead of hiding behind glass and steel and bodyguards, maybe we'd get better leadership and a little more concern for the future.
I'm sure I'll have more as the torturous months of Killary and the Trumpeter burn the last vestiges of sanity of the American society. Or which one ends up being the trickster incarnation on Oath.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
I am Abraxas, and so are you. Gods above God, and more human than human. I come to you in my meat-sack incarnation of Miguel Connor, broadcasting in the lawful and Nino-warm dystopia of Chicago, patiently waiting for the beginning of the world. I reject reality in most of history, as many of you know. The Holocaust and all other genocides, as well as rank bigotry and humanity, are exceptions. The ethos of Aeon Byte is to ensure that these historical profanities are avoided in the present and future. Ray Bradbury said he wrote science fiction not to predict the future, but to avoid it. The Sethians, in their obsession with Genesis and other Old Testament yarns, wrote about them to both avoid and predict the past that seems to come true over and over again. Or as Mark Twain said, history never repeats, but it certainly rhymes. Let's continue on this toxic political season, seeking ultimate freedom and the saving of the individual.
We need to be free men and women. If we're not free, then we're no different than Cylons.
On this late August, the year of our demiurge 2016, I can't think of two better individuals that encapsulate what I've been talking about, who truly embody the spirit of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio more than Gary Lachman and the late and great Colin Wilson. They are perhaps the two preeminent scholars on the occult and Western Esoterica of the 20th and early 21st century. Gary materializes at the Agora of Hermes Thrice Great to actually discuss the Gnosis of Colin Wilson. From his new book, Beyond the Robot, The Life and Work of Colin Wilson. It's always an honor to have Gary back. I've said plenty on the elegant, sapient, and third-eye opening work of Gary and his contribution on past shows that include the topics of Hermeticism, Blavatsky, politics and the occult, Crowley, Jung, and so many more. Check them out at our archive of past shows or YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, and other digital channels. For more information on Gary, please visit GaryLachman.co.uk.
From now on, there'll simply be all these robots walking around, feeling nothing, thinking nothing. And there'll be nobody left almost to remind them that there once was a species called a human being, with feelings and thoughts, and that history and memory are right now being erased, and soon nobody will really remember that life existed on the planet.
Some of you may be wondering how Colin Wilson represents the Gnostic philosophy and struggle. Beyond his new existentialism that keenly parallels classic Gnosticism, that mixture of nihilism and solar enlightenment, you will notice the similarities in our interview. Beyond that, let me read you a passage from the excellent biography of Gary, Beyond the Robot. Oh, you Mr. Robots. By Odin's dingleberries, the Gnostics are perhaps the ultimate outsiders Wilson wrote so much on. Here is the passage. The outsider is someone who sees too deep and too much, and that most of what he sees is chaos. He or she lives in the world with a sense of strangeness and unreality. The safe, stable reality that most of us perceive is for the outsider an illusion, a facade obscuring a more dangerous and threatening possibility, that of nothingness, nihilism, and the void, the complete inconsequentiality of human life and all its achievements. For the outsider, the values and meanings that constitute life for most people, a good job, a big home, a nice bank account, are empty and makeshift. They are, at best, attempts to gloss over, to make look civilized and rational something that is savage, unorganized, irrational. He stands for reality. He seeks a meaning and purpose that the everyday world cannot provide, and his salvation lies in understanding this and embracing it with total conviction. It's a recognition that life does not lead to anything, but is an escape from something. Doesn't get more Gnostic than that. As I say, a little bit simpler, it's all about writing your own gospel and living your own myth.
My friends believed in me, but they need some kind of hero.
Then be a hero.
Oh, no. You don't understand. I'm not even supposed to be here.
That's right. You came a long way to find something that isn't out here. Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them.
But I can't go back.
Don't know that you got a choice, son. No man can walk out on his own story.
Led us to the interview with Gary on his biography of Colin Wilson. Oh, and please don't forget to support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. July and August were record-breaking months in terms of traffic and listens. So we are accelerating the saving of the individual and the liberation of humanity from politics. But Patreon and other donations actually went down. Your support solely keeps this Red Pill cafeteria open. Let's continue this revolution of the spirit and the mind in the name of Hypatia of Alexandria. Much appreciation to you Mr. Robots going beyond the robot who support this venture on a weekly basis. Hello and goodbye as always.
The process that creates this boredom that we see in the world now may very well be a self-perpetuating, unconscious form of brainwashing created by a world totalitarian government based on money, and that all of this is much more dangerous than one thinks. And it's not just a question of individual survival, Wally, but that somebody who's bored is asleep, and somebody who's asleep will not say no. And he told me that he no longer watches television, he doesn't read newspapers, and he doesn't read magazines. He's completely cut them out of his life because he really does feel that we're living in some kind of Orwellian nightmare now, and that everything that you hear now contributes to turning you into a robot.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have the pleasure of being joined by Gary Lachman, this time to discuss his book, Beyond the Robot, The Life and Work of Colin Wilson. How are you doing today, Gary?
I'm doing very well, Miguel. Thank you very much for having me on the show again.
It's always an honor having you on. So tell us, Gary, how was writing this book? Because you've written many books, you've written about many great figures, and obviously Colin Wilson is somebody you admired. He's a towering figure in Western Esoteric, but he was also a friend. Was it different writing this type of book?
Yeah, it was very much. It was something in a way I wanted to do for a long time, but not to sound morbid, I always felt I couldn't really do until Colin had moved on, as it were, which he did. He died 2013 in early December. And yes, I'd known him for 30-something years. I first met him in 1983 when I was a much younger man, and so was he. And I was on a kind of mini search for the miraculous in Northern Europe with a friend of mine, and we were going around to places like Chartres Cathedral and Notre Dame and Glastonbury and Stonehenge and all these different sorts of places. And at some point we split up, and one thing, somewhere I wanted to go on my own was sort of down myself to make a pilgrimage to where Wilson lived in Cornwall. And so that was in 1983, and I continued the connection. The French developed into a friendship, and we corresponded, and so on and so on. And when he came, I was living in Los Angeles. When he came, he visited, and to give lectures, and we met, and so on and so on. And but just to say who he is, I mean, Wilson is most famous for his first book called The Outsider, which came out in 1956 when he was only 24. And he was hailed as a Britain's homegrown existentialist. This was the time when existentialism and writers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and others from France were very influential and very popular. And Wilson's first book is a study in sort of extreme mental states and alienation. And it concerns this archetypal figure that he called the outsider, who basically is someone who is outside of society. He's not necessarily a rebel against it, but he or she is someone who's in search of a kind of values or sort of intensity of experience in life that modern, everyday, material-based, society can't provide, and positively has no place for, really. And so Wilson sort of charted the sort of outsider's experience through different literary and real life figures, people like Nietzsche, people like T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, the painter Van Gogh, but also through the novels of Sartre and Camus and Hermann Hesse, and so on and so on. And he was sort of an overnight sensation. You would never have thought a book about angst and anxiety and alienation and sort of madness would have gone over so well. But he got caught up in a kind of literary event in the late 50s, which was dubbed in Britain the Angry Young Men. And they're sort of vaguely related to the Beat generation in the States. There was these very younger writers, many of them from a working class background, who had a more social kind of message. Many of them were far left or certainly socialist or left-leaning. And whereas Wilson's take on this alienation was much more of a religious, sort of spiritual kind of take. But in any case, he became overnight sensation. He was the book was a bestseller, even in the States. And he was in the newspapers all the time because he was young, and this was this kind of trend. It was this kind of fad. And then the critics turned against him soon after. They all got very sick and tired of the Angry Young Men. Sort of like they were, in a way, they were kind of like the punks of the late 50s. In a certain kind of way, they were very aggressive and young, and sort of calling for a complete change in everything. And they too were talking about no future in a certain way. And it was in the newspapers a lot, in the gossip columns, and and sort of the Sunday supplement papers. And Wilson got caught up in that. And he was actually, for a while, he was in the newspapers all the time, and he was a celebrity, sort of. And then it all kind of came crashing down, and they turned against him. And he basically withdrew and went down to Cornwall in this remote sort of fishing village. That when he went down there in sort of 57, there was nobody there. I mean, it's since built up, and there's many more houses and so on. But it was almost a wilderness when he and his wife Joy went there, and he just stayed there, hunkered down, and wrote many books, developing what he called a new existentialism, which we can get onto later, which had a much more positive kind of content to compared to sort of the existentialism of Sartre and Camus and the German philosopher Heidegger. But in any case, I just discovered his books when I was 19 in 1975, living in New York when I was playing in Blondie. to mention the punk, kind of connection in a way, in a vague sort of way. I was in my own kind of, counterculture milieu, and one of the books I came across, because there was a lot of stuff left over from sort of the 60s, earlier kind of countercultural sort of days, and there was a lot of interest in the occult, as you know, and as I've written about in my first book, Turn Off Your Mind.
Right.
And one of the books I came across at this time was Wilson's book, The Occult. And because of the occult revival that happened in the 60s, he was asked to write a book about the occult in the late 60s. And he first approached it thinking, well, I'm just doing this for the money, because, he lived by his pen, as it were. He's a professional writer. And he accepted the commission, but at first he was very dubious about the occult. I mean, he was very interested in mysticism and what we would call spirituality today, but he was, much more rigorous kind of thinker. And saying he came out of existentialism and all that, so he didn't really think too highly of the occult. I mean, it was an interest of his, but it wasn't something that was particularly, a passion in any way. But then when he did the research for this book, he changed his mind completely, and the book was a huge success, as big a success as his first book. So he became established as this sort of occult, paranormal, esoteric authority, and that's how I first encountered him when I first read his book, The Occult, in 1975, and that's what got me interested in him, and it also set me on my path, to where I am today, having written all these other books. So that was a bit of a mouthful. So I'll let you catch up there, Miguel.
No, that's a very good snapshot of a very fascinating life. And like all your books, I believe all your books is what I call, they're very highlight friendly. I find myself highlighting so much and getting so much information. It was a great read. But one thing you do mention in your book, Beyond the Robot, you mentioned this more than once, is that the central theme for Colin Wilson's life was something called the paradox of freedom. What is that, Gary?
Well, this is something that he starts the occult, the book The Occult with, and he more or less says the sort of the basic theme of all my books. And he had written quite a few books by then, between 56 and when The Outsider came out, in 71 when The Occult came out. He had written quite a few books and novels. But it's what he calls the paradoxical nature of freedom. And it's this recognition that freedom is something that, when it's threatened, or if we're deprived of it, and of course freedom is a big term, and so it comes in different sorts of forms. But in the most obvious ways, when it's threatened, we understand its value. We grasp its value immediately, and we'll do anything to protect it. And suddenly the value of our freedom and the value of our life, and we no longer take it for granted. And so somehow the threat to freedom makes it more alive to us, makes it more vivid and immediate. But we have this strange problem that once we sort of meet the challenge to our freedom, whatever it may be, once we defend it, we've secured it again. We have this tendency to once again fall back into taking it for granted, and it becomes dull and numb, and we no longer feel it vividly. We actually start to feel it as a burden. It's something that weighs on us. We feel like we have time to kill. That was the title of a very popular book in the 60s by Erich Fromm called Escape from Freedom. And so Wilson, this is something that this outsider figure, feels instinctively, or some of the more intellectual ones start to try to understand conceptually, like what happens. And one of the key books that Wilson points to, embodying this specific problem, which is the central problem of the outsider, and he feels the central problem of human consciousness itself, is Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf. Now, just an aside here, like millions of other adolescents and teenagers in the late 60s and early 70s, I was one of the big Hermann Hesse readers. I mean, he was huge then. Hesse was a German novelist from sort of the, he died in 61, I believe, and, his great books were written in sort of the 20s or, around World War I. But this book, Steppenwolf, Wilson wrote about it, and he was one of the first writers in English to write about Hesse when the Outsider came out in 1956. Most of Hesse's books weren't in print. Many of them weren't translated. And he really hadn't been, he wasn't someone that people really talked about. And making the point that Wilson could be credited with sort of, triggering the kind of Hesse revival that turned into a huge, global phenomena in the late 60s and early 70s. But in any case, Hesse's character in this book, The Steppenwolf, is a figure named Harry Haller. And he's sort of a middle-aged intellectual scholar, and he has everything he really needs for the kind of life that he would want to live. He lives alone. He has two nice rooms, a nice flat in a nice house, and it's well kept and all that. And he has sufficient money, and he has all his books, and he has his gramophone records, which were a new thing at the time. And he can do what he likes and goes to concerts and so on. But he finds that even with all these things that one would think would satisfy him, he feels this kind of constant sense of dissatisfaction, of some sense of frustration, of some kind of sense of just not really living. And the book starts out with him sort of walking around the city he lives in, sort of basically putting off time going back to his flat because he's decided once he goes back there he's going to slit his throat, because he can't take these kind of lukewarm, nice, they're not bad days, but they're not fantastically great days either. They're just all kind of, one day after the other. And what happens is that before he goes home, he sits at a pub, at a cafe, and has a glass of wine. And somehow having the wine triggers this change in him. And suddenly he's reminded of what he calls Mozart and the stars. And he has this sort of mystical kind of experience, but not like a full-blown kind of, psychedelic mystical experience. But what happens is that he becomes aware of his freedom again. And the things that before couldn't reach him suddenly become alive. And so he's reminded of all the things that he loves, and he's reminded of music, and he's reminded of art, and he's reminded of his own life. And so this is an experience that Wilson says that we have. We sort of go between these poles. Most of the time we take everything for granted. And it's only in these sort of chance moments that we suddenly have a clearer view of everything, and our freedom becomes real to us again. So out of this whole thing, he develops this recognition that somehow a crisis, when your freedom is threatened in some way, either very obviously, say, when he points to, in the beginning of the occult, he points to the Soviet tanks, pulling into Warsaw to sort of, put down the uprising then. Or, all we have to do is think about any other kind of situation, say, in, say, Turkey today, when people are being arrested and so on and so on. When our freedom is threatened in that way, it becomes obvious to us how important it is, and it becomes obvious how much value the things that we love have. He makes the same sort of point in a different way when he talks about the writer Graham Greene, who is a British novelist, and he wrote books like The Power and the Glory and Brighton Rock. And Greene was sort of a very, very realist kind of writer, but he also had a very grim kind of vision of things in the world. And he tells the story of how when he was a teenager, he became so utterly bored. I mean, nothing could reach him. I mean, he would see things, nature, whatever, paintings or hear music that he knew was beautiful, but he couldn't feel that it was. Its beauty didn't reach him in any kind of, real vital way. And he became so bored that he, when he discovered a revolver that his older brother had hiding in the cupboard, he took it and he went out to a kind of common, a common ground, like a big, like Boston Common, some big open area. And he started playing Russian roulette with it. And what happened to Greene was that when he turned the sort of the bullets around, spun the chamber, and then pulled the trigger, and then he heard the hammer hit the gun, and there was just a empty, hollow sound because there was no bullet in the chamber. He suddenly had this intense, vivid sense of life's possibilities opening up to him. So 3 seconds earlier, he was so bored to tears that he was willing to put a gun to his head to get any kind of feeling out of him. And then as soon as he kind of kind of relaxed after, tightening up, waiting to hear whether, he's going to blow his brains out or not. And he kind of went tensed up and then relaxed. Suddenly everything became beautiful. Suddenly he could feel all of the meaning and all the beauty and everything that wasn't reaching him. And so various other examples of this Wilson puts together, and he comes up with this theory, or a kind of recognition that somehow crisis can waken our appreciation for what we have, for our freedom, when positive conditions don't. Many kind of positive good conditions where our freedom isn't threatened. One would think we would be able to feel it better then. I don't have to fend off any kind of threat or meet any kind of challenge. I got my freedom in front of me, and now I'm going to use it to the full. But we all know that doesn't happen, even in our everyday lives. We work all week, and then we think, okay, on the weekend I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Boy, I'm really looking forward to doing. And it comes, and then you think, oh God, it suddenly isn't as exciting anymore. So we all kind of accept it. This is the homely wisdom that Joni Mitchell put in her song, Big Yellow Taxi. We don't know what you don't know what you've got till it's gone. But we all know this. It's something that's recognized in human nature, but we kind of accept it. This is how things are. Well, Wilson was this kind of very intense, determined fellow, and he wanted to know, well, why what actually is happening, and why is it the other way around? Why is it that when crisis presents itself, we somehow become more alive, and we our spirits raise to meet the challenge, and suddenly everything becomes more real to us. He tells the story of how Sartre, during the occupation of Paris, when he was sort of working for the resistance, and had he got stopped by the Gestapo, whatever, he could have been arrested. He never felt more free. It's a strange paradox. So the paradox is, when we have freedom, we don't know what to do with it. When we don't have it, we'll do anything we can to get it again. So why can't we maintain that kind of perception, of the value of the freedom? But basically, why can't we hold on to the reality of our values? And so Wilson comes to his conclusion that there's something wrong with human consciousness, and then this becomes the central idea, or the central aim of all of his work. That as I said, he wrote over 100 books, and his career lasted more than half a century. So he explored this one insight in many different areas.
Like you write, Gary, and I'm paraphrasing, the biggest challenge wasn't a life of challenge, but a life without challenge. And for the listener, you don't have to get a gun or go to the resistance to get this peak experience. As you write, Colin Wilson had his own peak experience. He walked the walk, and that's the time where he was bored on a trip, and he thought Joy was pregnant, his wife, and she went to the bathroom and came back and said, "Oh, I just had my period," and suddenly he had his own little satori.
Yeah, I mean that's yes, exactly. This was one of his, should we say, in his own experience. This was he was very good at paying attention to his own experience and his own inner states. This is what he would later say was what phenomenology was about, and phenomenology is a philosophical sort of method or school out of which existentialism came. But in a nutshell, in the way that Colin used it, it's basically about becoming very aware of your inner states and sort of fluctuations in consciousness, and being able to sort of note them and kind of recognize them, categorize them in a certain way. And but no, he talked about he had this experience when he and Joy were on a holiday, and but she had missed her period, and they were walking along a beach. Is an area called Tynemouth in sort of in Cornwall, and Colin was thinking, oh, maybe we better get back to London. This is when they were still living in London, and I don't know, whatever we need to do now. If you're going to be pregnant, we need to find a new place to live, and so on and so on. And basically, neither of them really were looking forward to it, but they were ready to deal with it. Joy went into the loo, into the ladies' room, and she was in there for a while, and she came back out, and they carried on walking, and she hadn't said anything, And then Colin said, okay, well, what should we do? Should we go, should we just go back to London now? And she said, why? And he said, oh, and then she realized, and she said, oh, no, it's fine. It came on, her period came on. And the relief, suddenly this was tremendous. And one can imagine, oh yeah, of course it would be. Okay, you're worried about this, and then suddenly you don't have it. But that in itself is the essence of what Wilson recognized, was that you suddenly you have all this tension, this stress, this worry, and you're all kind of tightened up, and then suddenly that's you let go of that. The problem is solved. The inconvenience is taken away, and suddenly, you can let go. And when he did that, it went from being the kind of more or less normal relief one would have into what he later, borrowing the term from the American psychologist Abraham Maslow, called the peak experience. Now, Maslow was someone, one of the few people who actually recognized what Wilson was doing, and the two of them corresponded a great deal. And Wilson would later write a book about Maslow, and Maslow quoted and referenced Wilson's work in many of his own works. And Maslow's most known for what I just mentioned, this phenomenon called the peak experience. And he started out sort of a Freudian, but then he got tired of basically studying sick people. He wondered why is all psychology about sick people? What? Let us look at what the psychology of healthy people are. And so he gathered around the healthiest people that he could find. Asking different friends and associates. Who would you say of the people would be considered healthy, and so on and so on, in a variety of ways, physically, mentally, psychologically, and so on. And then he basically studied these people and questioned them, and one of the things that he discovered was that all of them would have these kind of moments of precisely what we were just talking about, of these moments of realizing their freedom, of actually grasping immediately and vividly, the values of the things that they love, the things that they have, the good, but basically the good things in their life, or not only about their own life. It would be something impersonal. It's the sort of thing where you would be happy because Mozart existed, and wrote his symphonies, or even just, simple beauty in nature or something impersonal. And he christened these sort of moments peak experiences. They were somehow these moments almost sort of granted, by grace. They sort of appeared out of nowhere, when the person having them would suddenly, have this sudden deep recognition and also feeling that, everything is good, and he or she would look out, and it would be in simple things. I mean, he tells a story of a housewife one morning getting her children, off to school, and her husband off to work, and in the hustle and bustle of kitchen, and doing cooking and gathering stuff. Suddenly some sunlight came through the window, and whatever, she saw it, and then she realized how happy she was and how wonderful it was to have children and to have her husband, and so on and so on. Or it could be, there's another story he tells of a Marine who had been stationed somewhere in some base out of the back of beyond, and hadn't seen a woman, for quite some time. And when he returned to another base, a bigger base, and he first saw a nurse, he was suddenly struck by how different women are from men, which is something we know, but we kind of take for granted. Most of our experience is sort of blunt. It's kind of dull around the edges. We kind of know all this stuff secondhand, but then actually say, well, actually, they are really different. and then you start to really see vividly and concretely the differences, and so on and so on. So these kind of experiences came to these people sort of intermittently, and Maslow associated it with having, sort of positive outlook, being sort of optimistic, being vital, putting energy into life, and so on and so on. And so, but Wilson picked up this notion of the peak experience, and then he thought, well, this is what is actually happening in the peak experience, what's taking place. And for him, he basically came to the idea that what happens is that it's not a mystical experience, is that consciousness is actually working as it should be working all the time. Most of the time we're in this sort of dull, asleep kind of state. If you want to be very radical, as Gurdjieff, the esoteric teacher Gurdjieff would call it. And
Wilson
Gurdjieff is someone else that Wilson wrote about and was influenced by.
One of the central themes, another central theme of Wilson, and this is what separates him certainly from the existentialists, is that of meaning. And Wilson saw this as his main contribution to philosophy. And he even wrote that purpose and meaning cannot be solved by logic alone, but by varying degrees of consciousness, which is something you've been talking about. And I remember you telling me once that that's the meaning of life is to find the meaning of life. You told me that in a past interview, and Wilson himself said that meaning is like food. It's not an end unto itself. It's what brings us this sort of energy that we tap into, that eternity of Blake into.
Well, this is the thing. He what Wilson liked about and was attracted to in sort of the existentialists that are more well known, like Sartre and Camus and Heidegger, is that they rejected all the kind of nice, cozy stories about reality and life and explanations, for it, either religious or scientific, and they too were concerned with freedom. They wanted to understand the nature of freedom and actually actualize it in experience. Sartre and Camus are very, very, very much about, their writings very much about freedom, and it makes a lot of sense. They were both, in Paris during the occupation, and so freedom for them was a very concrete kind of thing, and it also had, metaphysical and ontological, and so on and so on. So Wilson is very attracted to all that because he disliked abstract philosophy and the kind of very academic philosophy that was, and still is, dominant at the time. And he was drawn to people like Nietzsche, let's say, or Blake, and others like this who actually lived it. They were passionately involved. And what existentialism is about it's not abstract philosophy. It's philosophy about lived experience, and it's about the immediacy of experience. But what he felt that Sartre and Camus and Heidegger and the others were leaving out were precisely these kind of experiences, like the peak experiences, or the kinds of experiences that mystics. So Wilson read a great deal of sort of in the Western mystical tradition, people like Meister Eckhart and Jakob Böhme, others like that. He drew on many, many different sources. But what he developed, the philosopher who he basically founded his what he called his new existentialism. And I should say that after The Outsider, he wrote a series of books that aren't as well known as the first book, but they all belong to what he called the outsider cycle. And they explore different aspects of the outsider sort of phenomena, the outsider's problem, the outsider's challenge. And there's one called Religion and the Rebel, which looks at religion. There's another called The Stature of Man. And this is about what Wilson calls sort of the loss of the hero in modern literature. Again, he's writing about the literature in the 50s and the 60s and the early 20th century. And it concerns what he calls the fallacy of insignificance. This idea in the modern world that human beings are basically, insignificant, inconsequential, just, bits of reality like everything else. There's nothing special about us. This is one of the outcomes of the existential sort of turn in philosophy, is having, basically jettisoned God and any kind of supernatural sort of backdrop to reality, and also given up on the Platonic idea of some kind of realm of eternal truths and values. What Plato called the world of the forms. Anything. You can see starting, say, well, this can go this can go back quite a bit, but starting sort of the scientific turn, you can see gradually the elimination of any kind of meaning and significance to reality, and just accepting it as bare given. So this is what existentialism does. It's also how science sees it. There's no reason for anything. We'll just take it apart and see how it works, but there's no why behind it. And there's no one running it. It's just there. And so existentialism accepts that picture more or less, but it believes that you can kind of create a meaning within this, and this is the challenge that Sartre and Camus and Heidegger all face. But they set the limits they set the goalposts very, very low, because none of them accept none of them bring in these kinds of experiences that Wilson became obsessed with, really, these sort of meaning experiences, the peak experiences, the mystical experiences. When William Blake says you can see a world in a grain of sand. And all of that. Now so he studied the great Western mystics, but he also found expressions of it in people like Blake and people like Nietzsche, in the ballet dancer Nijinsky, who wrote this incredible diary. I mean, he was not particularly articulate or eloquent, but he was one of the most profoundly spiritual individuals at the time. And he could sort of express his spirituality. I mean, spirituality is such a lukewarm word for the kind of the way of being that Nijinsky tries to describe, but which he danced. And unfortunately, we can't see him dancing it. But he talked about God as fire in the head, and so all these people that Wilson was really concerned with, they were driven by this kind of inner need, this absolute necessity, which in many ways I think our contemporary spiritual world doesn't quite have. We're all too concerned about health and well-being and that kind of thing. And the people that Wilson's looking at, they were all people that really sort of drove themselves in pursuit of this experience, this kind of experience of freedom. They had an instinctive sense that life should be lived at a much more intense level. The Gospels talk about life more abundant, and this was something that all of Wilson's outsiders and Wilson himself, pursued. And he developed this philosophical sort of phenomenological way of trying to understand not so much how to produce mystical states as what our consciousness is doing to sort of edit down the reality. And he sees it in terms of, in very evolutionary terms. If just to sort of, cut to the chase, the accounts of mystical experiences all seem to suggest that reality in itself is much more meaningful in the sense of much more intense and vivid and strange. The world as we usually see it. This is why we go out of our way to change our consciousness, to get a little peek of that every now and then, from mild ways of changing it through alcohol and other sorts of drugs to more powerful sorts of things. But the whole idea is that, contrary to what the science or the existentialists were saying, the universe isn't meaningless. It's overwhelmingly meaningful, and we have somehow learned how to inhibit our consciousness of it, because too much consciousness of it makes us, is overwhelming. It basically makes us unfit for life. And so Wilson posits that, and this is something that other people like Aldous Huxley and others have said as well, that there's a kind of, the philosopher Henri Bergson, there's a kind of reducing valve. The brain, the nervous system works as a kind of reducing valve to cut out 99% of the meaning around us, because we don't need it for our survival. And what we're left with is a kind of, just enough to be able to deal with the world. But in moments of mystical experiences or peak experiences, or, at the end of the day, when you had a glass of wine and you relax, and suddenly, the table you're looking at seems suddenly much more interesting than it was about, 5 minutes earlier. This is because these different ways have somehow inhibited this inner editor in our consciousness, and or to change the metaphor, has somehow loosened the taps, loosened the faucet of reality into consciousness, and suddenly more of it is coming in. And so Wilson is trying to understand, okay, what's actually going on? What how do we arrive at this? Our consciousness is in a static state. It's been arrived at evolutionarily. We've gone through different changes until we got at this point, and so we should be able to learn how to open the taps of consciousness and let more of reality in, and which is another way of saying should be able to induce peak experiences at will. And this is something that Wilson basically tried to learn how to do and wrote about in all his books. And I should also say he wrote about so many different things. He wrote about the occult. He wrote about crime and murder. He wrote science fiction novels. I mean, some of his best work are in his early these kind of early Lovecraftian science fantasy novels that he did, The Mind Parasites and The Philosopher's Stone, and another one called The Space Vampires. I mean, these are all very readable, exciting, kind of philosophical science fantasy books, but they're all informed with Wilson's ideas about consciousness. And so this is one of the things that he tried to do, was to flesh out his ideas in sort of fiction. And this was also something that people like Sartre and Camus were doing when he was first writing. Sartre, most people, if they know Sartre, they know his novel Nausea, which presents his sort of and his ideas about consciousness in a novel form, or they know Camus' novel The Stranger. It was translated in the States, and so he wrote a great deal. I mean, and he's very, very readable. He was a popular writer. I mean, he writes about philosophy, but he's not in any way a kind of academic philosopher. And I think this is something that worked against him in many ways, because the initial kind of backlash, he never really got away from that, and then philosophy and writing about these kinds of things, it seems to me, over the years, has gotten more and more kind of cloistered. It's more and more academics have to do it. You have to do it in an academic kind of context. Wilson started writing at a time when you had reading public, or the publishing world, or whatever you want to call it, was more open to the kind of well-read, but non-academic public thinker. You think of somebody like Aldous Huxley would be somebody from an earlier generation. I mean, another one from a little bit earlier than Wilson was Arthur Koestler. So you don't really have these kinds of people these days. In my own humble way, I guess I'm trying to do that. But it's a different kind of world, and I think this worked against him. But I think today more and more of his philosophical ideas are getting out there. I've seen there's been articles about his work in some philosophical journals, so that might be a good sign.
Oh, agreed. And for some reason, Colin Wilson reminds me of the original, the primordial reason of philosophy, as Socrates said, preparing for death, which is basically learning how to live, something we've all lost. We're all asleep, like Gurdjieff said, or we're all dead, like the Gnostics said, and it's all about waking up and expanding our consciousness. I think you write about H.G. Wells saying that we're amphibians, we're always used to new land, and we just got to learn how to breathe. Yeah,
well, that's the thing. I mean, Wilson took that sort of metaphor from Wells, and because like Wells and like others that he was very influenced by, mostly the Wells's contemporary, the playwright Bernard Shaw, but also people like Julian Huxley and Teilhard de Chardin. Wilson has a very evolutionary view, and he does see the outsiders as kind of signs or indications of a new development in consciousness, and it is precisely this hunger and need for this kind of freedom. And again, its most concrete form, obviously, is kind of physical freedom. But the thing is, once you're ready, most of us have that already. I know, a great deal of the world, people don't have it. But I myself, throughout my whole life, I've never. The government has never in any way interfered with anything I've ever wanted to do, aside from, maybe smoke some substance or something. But, I'm not saying hooray for the government. I'm just saying I, in my whole life, have never felt the kinds of constraints on my freedom that people, say, years ago behind the Soviet bloc, or in the Soviet bloc, or behind the Iron Curtain, or today in North Korea, or say other places do. So for me, it's never been a question of that kind of freedom so much as, okay, what do I do with the freedom once I have it? And I think that there are more and more people. This is what Wells suggested, and others did also, is that, and Maslow in his studies as well. There are more and more people who are driven by a need and hunger for that kind of inner sort of freedom and this kind of pursuit of objective, impersonal kind of values. I mean, Maslow has this idea, what he calls the hierarchy of needs, and he said that human psychology is kind of driven by this kind of these various of needs that are arranged in a kind of ascending order, and the most basic one obviously is for food, and so that's but once we've satisfied our hunger, then we look for some place to sleep, some kind of territory, some kind of security of some kind, some sort of home, and then once you've achieved that, then you want company of some kind. And so a love relationship, a sexual relationship, or something like that. And the next thing is basically self-esteem, in the sense that you want the good opinion, the high opinion of your fellows and your peers. And so we all seek that from our friends and our acquaintances and workmates and all that. And in many ways today, I think it's so obvious that our whole it strikes me that all of affluent Western society is pretty much at that self-esteem level, because we're trying to get it all the time from all the the social media and Facebook and a variety of other kinds of ways where we put stuff up, and we want people to respond to it and people to notice us and all that, and we kind of pat each other's back in this way. But Maslow posited a further kind of need that he called the need for self-actualization, and whereas the four previous needs are kind of driven by a lack. We're missing something. We lack the food. We lack the security. We lack the companionship. We lack the self-esteem, and we go get it and satisfy that hunger. This other need is for actually being creative. It's not for getting something to fill a hole in ourselves. It's actually for using what we have, for creating something what we have, for doing something for its own sake, pursuing something for its own value. And whereas Maslow believed that we're all kind of built to move to that level, many people don't. Many people stay at the self-esteem kind of level. But he did believe there was a minority that carried on and were driven by these other kind of values. And they would be very different. They would be people that were interested in something that other people would think, well, yeah, I don't know, that's not my thing or something. And it would be something that, in many ways, it would be a very inner sort of pursuit, and it would be pursuing this kind of inner freedom, this inner expansiveness. And so Wilson sort of links this type, the self-actualizing type, with what Wells talked about, these kind of amphibians. These are people that want to get up, want to move into this other sphere of freedom, what Desjardins called the noosphere, which is the sphere of being. It's a sphere of being motivated by ideas, by inner values, pursuits of things like that, rather than driven by necessity, or driven by material, comfort or something like that. So it's people want to study philosophy, for itself, because it's a good in itself, not because it's going to help them get a good job. And believe me, it won't. You know what I mean? So it's people that are driven to pursue these kind of impersonal, objective kind of values. And Wilson believes that people of this sort, and they can be anybody, of any race, of any color, of any sex, across the globe. And but they're forming a kind of, what do you want to call it? A kind of vanguard, and they don't know each other, or they may, or maybe they're in touch, but it's not as if they're all hanging out together and self-actualizing, because that's the whole opposite of it. This is all work you do on your own, but they're all driven by this appetite, what he calls the evolutionary appetite, which is for this kind of this freedom, this kind of pursuit of objective values. And so and once you realize that's what you're doing, it's a different ballgame. I mean, one of the outsider's problems is that he or she feels like a misfit, in society. There's no place for you. You have a sense that you're driven by a deeper purpose and serious and seriousness than the world around you, and it's difficult to find a place in it. And not all outsiders are necessarily creative individuals, or at least successfully creative ones. And Wilson does talk about a particular kind and this is in having to do with his sort of criminological studies, where he talks about a particular kind of criminal that is more intelligent than average, but not quite intelligent enough to actually, successfully exploit his intelligence in society, to become a writer or a professor or something like that. But he builds up a resentment, and somehow it's a kind of frustrated creativity that goes sour, and it emerges in these kinds of radical acts of violence and crime, which are in some way a kind of substitute for a real creative act. And so this isn't only something about people's psychotherapy. It has effects on society at large. And what Wilson believes is, and the others too, is very important. Is for the people who fall into this camp, these amphibians, they need to recognize what it is exactly that they're in search of and pursuing, as they do, the idea is, and one hopes this is true, that gradually these values will permeate more and more of society. It's not as if there's going to be some sudden, overnight change, but the idea is that gradually, as more and more people become aware of and interested in and feel an appetite for this kind of inner freedom, society will gradually change because of that.
Another legacy of Colin Wilson, as you mentioned, is his book, The Occult. He brought Gravitas back to the idea of studying mystics and the esoteric. He himself became a true believer. Again, he walked the walk. He, as you write, he admitted that poltergeists existed. He was convinced there was life after death. But central to this theme of the occult is the idea of Faculty X. Could you tell us about that, Gary?
Yeah, well, Faculty X is a name that Colin gave to an experience that I think we all have, but again, it's not something that we tend to pay a lot of attention to. But it's what he calls the ability to grasp the reality of other times and places, and I emphasize the word reality there. And this ties in very much to what we talked about earlier about the paradoxical nature of freedom. Faculty X would be when you had an experience where you really did grasp the reality of your freedom. But he points to experiences or examples of it in different writers. One famous one is the French novelist Marcel Proust, and he begins this huge multi-volume work called The Remembrance of Things Past, telling a story about he was having a kind of biscuit, a kind of what we would call a kind of cookie or a little sort of pastry, and he tasted it, and the taste suddenly reminded him something, and he couldn't quite grasp what it was, but it was very vivid and strong, and he knew it was about something important, and so he made an effort, and he was able to remember what it was, and suddenly it all came back to him, and it reminded him of his childhood when he used to go on holiday in the north of France, and his grandmother there, his aunt, I forget exactly which, would give him a little taste of one of these biscuits, and they're called madeleines, and she would dip it into her tea and let him have a bite of it, and so the taste of the same thing many years later suddenly brought back the reality of his past. He knew he had spent his summers there as a child. It wasn't like he forgot about it. He knew it was there, but suddenly the vividness of it, the fact that it actually took place, came back to him. And then this had this tremendous effect on Proust at the time. He said he no longer felt mediocre, accidental, or mortal. He suddenly felt as if he was beyond time. And this was something, again, that Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf feels as well. As he sits and sips this glass of wine, he suddenly has a vivid memory of his own past too, and as if he sees images of all the places he's been, the women he's known, the books he's read, and all these kind of things come back to him. And you could even see an example of this in Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol at the end of the story, when Scrooge, having been, shown things about himself by, the ghosts of Christmas past and present and future, he suddenly comes back to life, and he's changed, from being this, very bitter, suspicious, greedy, unpleasant character. He's suddenly brought back to life. And so Faculty X is, again, it's basically consciousness working as it should, and us actually experiencing reality as it is, and not in the edited down version we experience all the time. And I have to point out, it's not like a psychedelic experience. You don't start hallucinating. It's not as if, things start changing into other things. If anything, it's much more like, say, the Zen experience of Satori, when you suddenly see something and you see it in this unique way. You see the isness of it. And Wilson believes that what happens is when crisis comes, some kind of crisis or inconvenience or some threat to our freedom takes place, when we overcome it and we breathe a sigh of relief, and suddenly, for a brief time, we not only have our freedom, we appreciate having it. It's as if it's something real in our hands that we can move, pick up and carry around. That's another fact. And he calls it Faculty X just because we don't have a name for this. And we don't have a name for that because, I would say mostly because our language is geared towards dealing with, the outer world. So in one of my earlier books, The Quest for Hermes Trismegistos, which is about the founder of magic and Hermeticism, thrice great as Hermes, I talk about the idea of Gnosis, and something, of course, you're very familiar with, through your studies of Gnosticism. And Gnosis means knowing or knowledge. It's a kind of knowing, but it's a particular kind of knowing, and I tend to call it knowing in italics. There's knowing, and then there's really knowing, and Faculty X is like Gnosis in that sense, is that it's an immediate, direct sort of, what do you want to say? It's kind of really knowing. You suddenly, just like, I know that when so-and-so was such and such a place last year, for a holiday, but that's different than my sort of having a whiff of something, come past me or tasting something, and suddenly, oh yeah, I remember sitting at that, at that cafe in France, and the smell of the coffee and everything comes back to you. So what Wilson is saying is that all that reality we have at our disposal at all times, but we don't know that we do, and we become so used to living in this kind of half-life state, this kind of sleep, that we never make the kind of effort to draw on this reservoir of reality that we carry within us, and we call it memory. But by chance, you could taste a biscuit and it'll happen. You can have a sip of wine, it'll happen, or you can face some kind of crisis. I mean, Wilson himself tells a story of how when his daughter Sally was still very young, and she and Joy, his wife, Sally's mother, were driving back to Cornwall from somewhere, and they stopped off someplace to check out a bookshop that Wilson knew. And what had happened is, at some point, Sally kind of slipped away from them, and each one thought she was with the other. And they realized that they didn't know where she was. They panicked, understandably. It was a busy place. There was lots of traffic and so on. And so they ran off looking for her. And she was only missing a short time, but when they found her, Wilson said he felt this immense relief. And it was so powerful. He felt so happy and grateful that nothing had happened to Sally, that even the smell of exhaust, coming from a bus, the traffic itself was a delight. He's basically saying is that there's a level or state or intensity of consciousness in which, most of the troubles that we worry ourselves about and dig an early grave for us, we see that they're really trivialities, and they're actually no troubles at all. And if we only perceive things from this state, we would see how wonderful, our life is and how it is. I mean, and he's not talking. This sounds like kind of, complacent sort of self-help stuff, and it's not really what he means. But it's the kind of mystical vision. It's the mystical vision that Blake has when he says that everything that lives is holy. Or Wilson tells the story of Dostoevsky. As a young man, Dostoevsky was arrested for his, political associations. And he was, with others, going to be executed in the Semyonovsky Square. And he was all lined up there, ready to, be shot. And he, just before, soldiers were going to fire, he thought he had a couple seconds left, and he devoted one to think about his, his family, and another to friends, and then he saw everything around him just suddenly seemed so intensely valuable. It was beyond, putting any kind of price on it. And miraculously, at the last second, the execution was called off. This vision stayed with Dostoevsky, for the rest of his life, and it turns up in all of his novels, where he contrasts an extreme sensitivity to pain and suffering. He knows all about this. He recognizes that there's enough pain and suffering in the world to warrant someone basically saying, well, there's no God, there's no meaning. This is just meaningless, cruelty. And against that, there's this vision that he had, faced with the ultimate crisis, and then the ultimate relief from it. And so it's very powerful stuff. I want to say it's not just kind of positive thinking kind of thing, although that does play a part in Wilson's overall approach to this. But I think the central thing is to recognize this whole, what he calls the paradoxical nature of freedom. And I think, why is it? What happens? What actually takes place in us when, we look forward to having the free time on the weekend to do whatever it is, to read Proust, to read Wilson, and then when it comes along, all the excitement somehow is gone. The value, the interest. What happened? We just accept this. This is just basically saying, we just accept this kind of low level, unsatisfying state of consciousness. Well, Wilson was somebody who didn't accept it, and neither were his outsiders, and he devoted his life to cracking that problem.
And for the listener, we have just scratched the surface in Gary's thought-provoking, and I would say third eye opening book on Colin Wilson. There's so much there. I mean, stuff that even I didn't know about, like how popular Wilson was in Japan and the Middle East. I mean, Gaddafi used to read his work once upon a time, and how he wrote part of Flash Gordon, and there's so much there. And there's even a part where you challenge somebody to a duel who wrote something insensitive about Wilson after he died. There's a lot.
There is, and I should also say he met so many of the famous and great. He met Huxley, Henry Miller, Albert Camus, Marilyn Monroe. One of his Groucho Marx was one of his readers, along with Muammar Gaddafi. He lectured everywhere around the world. He worked with lots of different people. So, I mean, there's wonderful stories. There's one wonderful story where in the early 60s, when he's in California on a lecture tour, and he spends an afternoon with Huxley, Christopher Isherwood, and Henry Miller. And so it's just there's all these kind of gossipy, good tales in there as well.
It's a wonderful book, and
it's a lot about sex too.
He definitely wrote about everything, he leaves a great legacy. A very wonderful man, and I'm very happy you're here to continue his work. Have you done? And you're becoming as prolific as he is, Gary. What are you working on next?
Well, what am I doing now? I'm working on a book now. The working title is The Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. So I will leave it to your imagination to wonder what that possibly could be.
We certainly look forward. You're not going to write Space Werewolves or something like that for your reportoire?
I am thinking of doing some Wilson pastiche, like Return of the Mind Parasites or something like that.
It should be
the time cannibals, or something like that.
We look forward to anything that comes out, Gary. We certainly look forward to having you back, but I think that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on and discussing your new book, Beyond the Robot, The Life and Work of Colin Wilson.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure, and I want to thank you for getting up so early to do this interview.
It's only time. We're looking for that peak experience, Gary. That's what matters.
Take care, Cal.
Please support AM Bite Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here or there. Join my Patreon campaign. Buy some of me reality-dispanding, mind-expanding books like Voices of Gnosticism, Heretic, or Stargazer. Subscribe to our archive of past shows. Your continued donations keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. The various avenues to assist me are found at thegodabovegod.com. Support alternative media away from the few corporations that own all mainstream media. I should mention that I am an Amazon.com affiliate, so any books you order from thegodabovegod.com grant me a kickback. In fact, if you order anything, whether it's clothes, appliances, or sex toys, click through the site and I will get a kickback from that as well. Even if you don't order anything advertised at thegodabovegod.com. Much appreciation to you, Knights of Valis, Shining Crazy Diamonds, and Rainbows in the Dark who support this blasphemy.